as the Republican primary has gone on and as voters have continued to sour on President Joe Biden, the polls have been leaning further in the direction of Donald Trump beating Joe Biden in the 2024 election. And this Siena College poll just illustrates that fact quite clearly. Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden by 5 points nationally. And of course, the aggregate overall is Trump +1. But the moral of the story being that even in a lot of the states we're going to look at, Donald Trump is by far and away the favorite to win them if the election were to be held today. So, of course, in this video, we're going to take a look at what the election would look like if the polls are accurate. And, of course, we're going to add a caveat to that, obviously, because making a video just on that would be quite lazy, and you could do it in just a few minutes on Google. But we're also going to factor in the incumbency advantage that Joe Biden is likely to have. Normally, incumbents tend to have a 3-point swing in the polls in their direction. So we're going to factor that in as well as we take a look at the polls in this video in the key swing and battleground states. So of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So it's been a while since I uploaded on this channel, but I figured I would come back with a video on some of the polls we've been looking at. We haven't talked much about the primaries, but don't worry, we'll make a video tomorrow on the impact of the Republican primary on Donald Trump's chances, because I do think the Republican primary does reveal some things about the electorate, and we're going to talk more about that in that video. But today's video, we're going to take a look at the election map as a whole. Now, some of the states that are already likely I've filled out based on the polling averages, and I've also factored in the polls swinging to Joe Biden by around 3 points, which would still put Iowa, Ohio, in the likely category. We really don't have any polling for Maine second and Nebraska second, so I just kind of filled that in as to where I think those districts are going to end up. But we're going to start off with Nevada, as we typically do, and work our way east. Now, what's really surprised me overall is just how much Trump is leading in a lot of these swing states, which isn't really something I anticipated, because earlier on, at the end of last year, we had Trump leading in the Rust Belt by a considerable amount, even as some of the other statewide candidates, candidates for Senate, what have you, were falling behind. We saw that in 2022 as well. In Pennsylvania, for instance, you'd have polls where Fetterman was up by a couple points and Trump was up by a few points in the state, so on and so forth. So you have to factor in that in 2024, there is going to be a different electorate than we've seen in the midterms and in a lot of these special elections, because you're going to have more low propensity working class white voters that haven't been voting in these off-year elections as much, coming out and voting for Donald Trump. So that is something I've overlooked in a lot of my prediction videos over the past year. It's something I want to correct, obviously, because I do think you're going to see more of those voters come out. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Trump's going to win these swing states at the end of the day, but right now the polling for him is certainly very encouraging. So Nevada, for instance, starting there, it's typically a state where Republicans are overestimated in polls. And if we take a look at the results in Nevada, according to RCP, Donald Trump is up by over 7 points, 7.7%. Now, even with a 3-point swing in Joe Biden's favor, Donald Trump is still winning the state of Nevada by 4 points. That's a lean margin. If he's winning Nevada by 4 points, chances are he's probably winning Arizona, Georgia, other Sunbelt states as well. So again, Nevada also tends to just overestimate Republicans in general, so maybe it'd be even more fair to factor in another 2 points in favor of Joe Biden, but that still would be a 2-point win for Donald Trump in Nevada, and that, of course, is enough to carry the state. You only need to win the state by 1 vote, theoretically, in the Electoral College to carry it, so that's really all Donald Trump needs. Looking at Arizona, another swing state. Now, this state's been a bit more, while it has been voting closer to Donald Trump in its elections, it seems to have been more hostile to him overall, and the polling reflects that as well. Donald Trump is up by 7 in Nevada. He's only up by 5 in Arizona. Factor in the polling swing that Joe Biden's likely going to get, and you're taking a look at about a 2-point margin of victory for Donald Trump. Still a lean margin, still carrying the state overall, but obviously it's going to be underestimated in the polls, I think, Joe Biden's margins in a lot of these states. Now, Arizona, Donald Trump won Arizona by 3.5 points in 2016. So based on the polling we have so far, Donald Trump would do worse in Arizona in 2024 than he did back in 2016 when he won the last time. And that actually makes sense, because the trend in Arizona has been going away from the GOP and more towards the Democratic Party, especially in suburban Maricopa County, where you have a lot of educated white voters. You have diversifying suburbs leaning more in Joe Biden's direction. So even with Trump doing better in some of these states, as we're going to see, like Nevada, which he lost by 2 points in both 2016 and 2020, he only wins Arizona by 2 points, which is an underperformance compared to where he was, of course, in 2016. Nevada, obviously, is a much more drastic swing towards the right. That's probably due to more working class Latinos probably voting for Trump in 2024. And again, I'm basing this off the polling. This isn't my actual prediction. This is just the polls factoring in Joe Biden's incumbency advantage, which even despite the fact that Joe Biden's unpopular, he's likely to have an incumbency advantage. We saw that in the last several presidential elections. We saw it with Obama in 2012. We saw it with George Bush in 2004, so on and so forth. So it's been a trend in American national politics for the past decade or so, and it's likely to continue to be a trend for the foreseeable future. Now, New Mexico is not a state I normally talk about as a swing or toss-up state, but since it's not a safe state, I figured we'd talk about it because the polling in New Mexico has Joe Biden up by 8 points. Now, not even. There's no aggregate for this, mind you. So if you average these all together, you have about Joe Biden plus 8. Now, if you give him a 3-point advantage, Joe Biden wins the state of New Mexico by 11 points. Now, I don't necessarily buy that just because I think Joe Biden would probably do worse in New Mexico if he's doing worse in the Sun Belt. But regardless, this is about the polls and the swings. So we'll give Joe Biden New Mexico by 11. Again, New Mexico is a very stagnant state. It mostly stays at about Democrat plus 8 to 10, give or take. So I don't really see that deviating in 2024. If anything, I think Trump would improve slightly more, but I still think, he'd probably lose the state by around 7-8 points at the end of the day. Texas is another interesting one because we've talked about Texas ad nauseum, the trends there towards the Democrats in suburban Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, etc. A lot of trends towards the Democrats in this state, but, Joe Biden is the standard bearer of the Democratic Party right now, and he's very unpopular. He's underwater by 16 nationally. In Texas, he's underwater by 25, some even say 30 points. So super unpopular in Texas. We take a look at the RCP average. Donald Trump is only up by 8 points. Now, you'd think with Joe Biden being underwater by 16, him being underwater in the state of Texas by over 25, that this margin would be a lot more lopsided for Donald Trump. As we're going to look later, Georgia is Trump plus 6. So and we'll make a separate video on Georgia later on in the week, but if Trump is only up in Texas by 8 points, that's really a sign that Texas is trending away from the GOP. Yes, Trump's probably going to win Texas in 2024, and he might even improve on his 2020 margins just because of how unpopular Joe Biden is. But that doesn't mean Republicans aren't in trouble in Texas in the future. You still have massive demographic change. Latinos now make up a plurality of the population in Texas. It's no longer a white majority state. That's going to have massive political implications. And I think when you have Trump up by only 8 points in an environment where he really should be up by double digits, really highlights that well. So, with the 3-point swing in favor of Joe Biden, that puts Trump at around plus 5, which is actually slightly less than where he was in 2020. But I really wouldn't be surprised if the margin we saw was quite similar because, again, Texas is trending away from the GOP pretty quick. And, even Abbott in 2022 was underperforming where he was in 2018. So you have all sorts of signs indicating the GOP, is in trouble. Now, they might get a lucky break in 2024 because of how unpopular Joe Biden is. And, the data doesn't lie. I've been saying for months and months that Joe Biden is the favorite in the 2024 election. And obviously, if data continues, I'm going to have to change that prediction just because it seems like despite everything, despite all the built-in advantages the Democrats have, Joe Biden might just be unlucky. Donald Trump might just get the lucky break he needs to win the 2024 election. And, these various state polls are highlighting that. Moving on up to Minnesota. Now, Minnesota is really not realistically in reach for the GOP, I think, in 2024 or maybe even the foreseeable future. There was that brief period of time after 2016 where a lot of Republicans thought that Minnesota was winnable. Republicans only lost the state by 1.5 points, which, was an abysmal performance for Hillary Clinton. But despite all that, she still won the state, albeit by a very tiny margin. And most of this was because of third-party vote not voting for Hillary Clinton. Because if we take a look at 2020, it was more of a reflection of where Minnesota typically votes, which is about Democrat plus 7. And if we take a look at the polls so far, Joe Biden is up by 3 in Minnesota, give him a 3-point advantage. He's at about plus 6. So a slight swing towards the right. I could see that being very plausible. Joe Biden up in Minnesota by 6 points. Moving on over to Wisconsin. We take a look at the Wisconsin polls. Trump is up by 1 point in Wisconsin. So if we give Joe Biden a 3-point swing in the polls, Biden would win the state of Wisconsin by 2. So this is where you start to see the polls actually a problem for Donald Trump. It's not so much in the Sun Belt where he's doing a lot better than where he was in 2020 and even 2016 in some cases in regards to Nevada, but the Rust Belt is where you start to see the issue. So if Trump is up by only 1 point in the RCP average, and granted in 2016 Hillary Clinton was up by 10 points, Trump was up by 1.7. Of course, Trump ended up losing Wisconsin in 2020 by around 0.6. He would lose it in this scenario by 2 points. Now, again, I'm just basing it off of this little model here, not my exact prediction, but just to highlight the fact that if you give Joe Biden a 3-point swing in these states, the results start to get a little interesting. Moving over to Michigan. Now, this is a state where Trump is ahead, and he's actually ahead by 3.6. If you give Joe Biden a 3-point swing in the polls, that would put Trump at 0.6%. That's actually double his margin of victory in 2016. In 2016, Donald Trump won the state of Michigan by around 0.3%. You give him about 0.6, that's literally double his previous performance. And this is kind of off the back of the whole Israel-Palestine. Of course, you've got a large Muslim constituency outside of Detroit and Dearborn and other communities. Very much against Biden because of the actions he's taken in regard to Israel-Palestine. And, depressed turnout among the Muslim demographic could give Trump the edge he needs in Michigan to win. Now, that doesn't mean these Muslim voters are going to vote for Donald Trump. He'd probably take a much more hardline position on Israel-Palestine. But it's just to highlight that if you have dampened voter enthusiasm among minority voters overall, that's going to benefit Donald Trump. Because if you have depressed Black turnout, Latino turnout, Muslim turnout, Trump benefits from all of that. Moving on up to New Hampshire. Now, this is a state that really is sort of lost for the national GOP, especially when it comes to Trump and Trump candidates, because Donald Trump is down by 8 points in New Hampshire. Give Biden a 3-point swing. That's bordering on safe. That's an 11-point margin of victory for Joe Biden. And that's not really unrealistic given what we've seen. Don Bolduc losing by 9, Trump losing by 7 in 2020. So it seems like the trend is only indicating a further swing towards Joe Biden and the Democrats. And that's despite everything, despite the fact that Joe Biden is massively unpopular nationwide. There are still some states where it doesn't matter. The electorate is either just so anti-Trump or anti-Republican that it just simply doesn't matter. Moving on down to the Keystone State, this is going to be another super important state for Donald Trump if he wants to win the 2024 election. Taking a look at the RCP average, Joe Biden is actually up by 0.8% in Pennsylvania. Now, this should be pretty alarming because Donald Trump is up nationally, but he's down in Pennsylvania. And the only reason he's even as close is because there's a +6 poll in the aggregate, which I think you could really throw out. I think the +2 for Trump, +1, +3 are a lot more realistic. So Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt, is really going to be the thorn in Donald Trump's side. Now, the interesting thing is if he wins Michigan, along with Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, he wins the election. So he only needs Michigan, realistically, to win the election if he has Nevada. So we could see a really weird election map where you have Michigan going for Donald Trump, Nevada going for Donald Trump, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania going for the Democrats. Would be pretty interesting, but that would put a lean margin of victory in Joe Biden's column for Pennsylvania. Now, Virginia also gets kind of interesting because we look at the Virginia polling average. Biden is up by 4 points. 3-point swing, he's up by only 7. Now, that's 3 points less than his margin of victory in Virginia in 2020, which was 10. And I honestly could see Donald Trump improving marginally in Virginia just because of Joe Biden's unpopularity, maybe depressed minority turnout in Hampton Roads, Richmond. That could potentially give Donald Trump Virginia Beach back. Chesterfield, although Chesterfield I'm not so keen on. These suburban counties, I think Biden will still win, but I think the margin in the state is going to be brought down overall because you'll probably see Trump improve in places like Richmond, Petersburg, these minority majority areas where there's probably going to be less Democratic turnout and probably more Republican enthusiasm to get rid of Joe Biden. So, Virginia +7 or 8 for Joe Biden isn't that unrealistic. Now, again, we've talked about Virginia potentially in a different scenario where there's other Republican candidates, I think they would do significantly better. But, you know, Nikki Haley's out of the Republican nomination as of a couple days ago. So this is really the cards that the GOP has been dealt. This is what you have to deal with if you're a Republican voter. You don't really have the luxury of doing hypotheticals between, you know, nameless Republican candidates and Joe Biden. Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, is very likely going to be the Republican nominee, I should say. And that's kind of the cards Republicans have been dealt. You know, North Carolina, this is another state where, kind of like with the other Sunbelt states, you've got a pretty massive margin for Donald Trump relative to where it usually is. Now, Clinton was up by 1 point at this point in 2016, and Donald Trump is up by 5.7. You give Joe Biden a 3-point swing. That's a 2.7% margin of victory for Donald Trump. That's a lean margin, and that's pretty realistic because North Carolina is a state where Republicans tend to do obviously better. North Carolina votes to the right of the national average. It typically goes to Republicans in statewide and federal races. And while this is a smaller margin of victory for Trump than in 2016, again, this is a state where you have urban areas, Raleigh, Charlotte, Fayetteville, trending away from the GOP. And while you have some rural gains, this has been moving the state towards the left as a whole. So, you know, North Carolina going to Donald Trump by 2 points, really not that unrealistic. Now, again, at this point in 2020, Donald Trump was leading in a lot of these states. This was right around the time COVID became a thing. And of course, obviously, shortly after that, Trump had a lead, and then he dropped pretty massively over the summer, which is when I started to change my prediction to Joe Biden actually winning. Now, moving on down to Georgia. Now, we've talked about Georgia, and I want to spend a whole video on Georgia because, you know, demographically and politically, it's a very interesting state. But Donald Trump right now is up by 6.5 points in the polling aggregate. You give, of course, Joe Biden the typical 3% swing that incumbents typically get, and that would put Trump at a 3.5% margin of victory, which is less than his 2016 margin of victory, but again, more so than his 2020 loss, obviously. And that's a pattern I think you're going to see throughout a lot of these swing states, potentially in 2024, because you'll probably have Trump do worse than in 2016 in a lot of these Sunbelt states, but it's still going to be enough to win overall because he wins Nevada. He does slightly worse in Arizona, does worse in Georgia, worse in Texas, worse in North Carolina, but it's still enough for him to win the states by a couple points. And then if you flip Michigan, it's basically game over. Even if Joe Biden is winning Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, it doesn't matter. You know, Trump would still win the election. Obviously, Florida is going to go to Trump. You know, Trump is up by, you know, double digits in Florida. You know, you give Biden a 3-point swing. That's a 7-point margin of victory. That's more than his 2020 margin of victory. So this is what the polling would look like in 2024 if the polls as of today are accurate, and you take about 3 points away from Donald Trump and give them to Joe Biden, which is like the typical incumbency swing that we've seen. We saw it with Obama and we saw it with Donald Trump in 2020, even though it wasn't enough to win the election overall. Donald Trump did overperform based on what the polling was saying up until the election. So this is what the map will look like. We'll be releasing more videos now more frequently. We took a bit of a break on this channel, but we're back with more regular content. So of course, tomorrow and Sunday, we'll have videos out. Obviously, stay tuned for those. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing down below and like this video down below. Again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.